The Research Left Behind with Professor Ashley.
Hello and welcome to The Research Left Behind, the only Twitch stream, YouTube show, and podcast, depending on your mode of access, that sweeps the cutting room floor to bring you the research that got left behind. My name is Professor Ashley, and yes, I'm a real professor who teaches people how to make video games. I am also sick tonight, so apologies for my voice. I'm going to try really hard not to cough. Tonight I'm joined by Dr. Jim Malazita, author of many articles on the subject of digital humanities, feminism, and platform studies. But tonight we are focusing on just one. Enacting Platforms, Feminist Technoscience, and the Unreal Engine is the name of the book. And if you're watching the live stream, oh, he's got it right there, folks. And if you're watching the live stream, you could type !book into chat to get the open access link right now and read it for free. If you're watching or listening after the fact, please check the episode description for that link. And either way, this book is free for you to read thanks to MIT Press's Open Access Fund. Faculty, staff, and students, please join me in welcoming Dr. Malazita to the show and thank him for telling us all about enacting platforms.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for following through with being sick. Hi, everybody. Excited to hang out and chat a little bit about Unreal Engine and Bioshock and all types of really interesting, I think, game history and game sociology.
Awesome. I'm really glad that you're glad to be here. And apologies if my sound effect was very loud for me. Hopefully it wasn't for you. But before we start talking about the book, we have to do our conflict of interest disclosures, which is, of course, a joke. This is a fun, I served on the Institutional Review Board for 6 years, so this is a fun joke we like to make. There is no human resources department here. In fact, we only have our moderator, Chris, to keep us in line if something goes wrong. So everyone say hi to Chris, the moderator. But still, let's figure out how we know each other, because as chat likes to say, this is our lore drop. So Jim, do you remember how we met?
Well, I think the first time we met was at Utah, right? You guys were shifting into your new home in the design school, and you put together a really great gathering of different games academics from all different disciplines, from like history and computer science and anthropology and media studies. And I was really lucky to be invited out. And so I think we first met there and got to tour your facilities and hang out with your awesome students. And now, fortunately, of course, we get to see each other a lot as we're both board members of the Digital Games Research Association, or DIGRA, which is in my unbiased opinion, the premier international Games Research Association. Wouldn't you agree, as the president of DIGRA?
Yeah, I mean, I have to, right? Oh no.
How's that for a conflict of interest?
Yeah. I mean, that's why we call it a COI, right? So I'm drinking chamomile tea. What are you drinking?
I'm drinking a fake Arnold Palmer. So yeah, I'm ready to go.
Okay, sorry. How is it fake?
In that it's not actually a branded Arnold Palmer, and I don't think a lemon nor tea has ever been near this. It's like two of those like 0-cal fake sugar things just kind of mixed together. So, it might be cancerous, but it's probably fine.
Yeah, it's probably fine. Plus, who wants to live that much longer? Anyway, let's get into the research left behind in enacting platform. So first of all, belated congratulations. The book came out in 2024. Publishing a book, as chat knows, we have a lot of folks in chat who are academics. They can tell you publishing a book is an entire accomplishment in its own right, but getting a book that's open access is a ginormous achievement. So very well done to you. I'm not going to play the sound effect again, but I will clap.
Yeah, and that was really thanks to MIT Press. They ran a fundraiser that year, and they were able to cover many of their books were made available through that in open access, including mine. So I really do have to thank MIT and Noah Springer, my editor on the series, and Ian Bogost and Nick Montfort, who were the Platform Studies series editors, of which this book is a part. All of whom really helped, push us through so that people could access it for free.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I love the folks at MIT Press. So now that we've introduced the book, we can get started in talking about the research that got left behind. And chat, if at any moment you have a question for Dr. Malazita, or a question about the book, or a question about Unreal Engine, please do feel free to type it in chat, and Chris, the mod, will hold it to the end, and we'll take questions and answers from the audience at the end. So this says a lot about you as a person, I think, Jim. You have one of the longest and nicest acknowledgement pages of any book I've literally ever read. You mention the standard things, of course, right? You thank your pets and your partner, and Taco Bell, obviously, have to.
Obviously.
But you also thank people that you randomly DM'd on Twitter as part of the research process. So I was wondering if you could walk me through that a little for the benefit of, I mean, all of us, but also students. When we think about how an academic book gets published, one of the things that you did really, really well in this book is acknowledge the shoulders of the giants, or the giants whose shoulders you stood on, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And, as you know, when you're doing games research, it's such, relatively speaking, a new field with such new media that there's not a super established way or super established methodology. We're borrowing from so many different resources, which means we kind of have to be creative in how we're doing this research. And I don't think this book would have been done, oddly enough, without social media. And just folks, including like Tim Sweeney. Not that I've had a conversation with Tim Sweeney, who's the founder and owner of Epic Games, but who makes the Unreal Engine. Tim is a regular tweeter of a lot of his internal thoughts, which really help contextualize a lot of the decisions that I see being made in the book and talk about in terms of Epic's and Unreal's movement. But beyond like the kind of discourse analysis of major media figures, talking to folks who work with game engines and work with Unreal specifically was really key to what I'm doing. I have undergrad and master's training in game development, but my PhD's in cultural studies, and so being able to talk to folks who are kind of quote like on the ground was really important. So Freya Holmer is a game developer. They work primarily in Unity, but they're also branching out to Unreal, and they make really funny game development memes, which actually started me down an entire chapter path. We'll talk about that in a little bit with the Z-axis. But also, again, really importantly, a shout out to my fellow faculty members in the Games and Experiential Media Department at RPI, who, in addition to just being super, super supportive, were there to, help me answer and think through technical questions that, I might not have had the depth of knowledge to really get into the nitty gritty of why certain things are done the way they are. So, being around a community of folks, both faculty and graduate students and undergraduate students, was and remains to be a really important part of my own academic development and scholarly thinking and writing and publication. Even if we're not co-authoring, I'm still very deeply influenced by the people around me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really powerful lesson to take away. I mean, we're not even in the book yet, we're in the acknowledgements. But never be afraid to DM someone, I guess, on Twitter for professional reasons.
Yeah, never be afraid to, worst they can say, well, I don't know, I guess I could block you, but like that's pretty much the worst they can do, right? And luckily, most people want to, as we're proving right now, want to geek out about the stuff we're interested in. So I don't know if anyone ever wants to DM me things on, I don't know, happy, let's do it, let's chat. But it's also just for me really important, especially with the current state of higher education and some of the attacks on the university system right now, like the importance of interdisciplinary departments, like how bringing a bunch of very different people with different backgrounds together really enhances the type of collective action that we can all do.
I was clapping. Yes. +1 to everything you just said. Okay, so let's actually get into the book now. I super impressed. Love the book. The intro chapter does a really good job of outlining the history of game engines overall, and I learned so much. Even I've been, teaching in games for 10 plus years, but I learned so much from the introductory chapter alone. But you have this one sentence in the chapter in which you note that Tim Sweeney originally named Epic Games Epic Mega Games. And that stuck with me. That was one of the funniest things I think I've ever read. And it's not that I didn't believe you, but I had to Google it for myself to figure out. And I found that, as you say in the book, right, Tim Sweeney comes from this comp sci background, wanted to compete with like the Duke Nukem. And so I just want to hear more about the research you did on Epic Mega Games.
Yeah. So the original name actually was Potomac Computer Systems, because Sweeney was grew up in Maryland and I think was attending the University of Maryland at the time. Even though he was a programmer as a mechanical engineering student, which I'll talk about in a bit, I think is actually maybe more important than he lets on. Although he in his own like personal lore, he does mention a couple times I was one credit short of finishing the degree, which I don't know. I don't have any way of verifying, but apparently he didn't finish, but was doing that. So the original company was Potomac Computer Systems, where he hired his childhood friend Carolyn Smith, who I always think is important to mention because women so frequently get written out of these stories. And in fact, I only saw her mentioned in like one magazine feature that had interviewed Tim maybe like 15 years ago. And I had a really hard time finding any additional information about her. So want to make sure she gets a shout out. And then Tim's dad, who basically accepted checks that were sent to him and would mail out like floppy disks of copies of the game. But once the company started consolidating a bit more, they changed their name to Epic Mega Games, and this is straight up admitted by Tim Sweeney because he thought the name would make the company sound bigger than it was, right? Like not only Epic, but Mega Games. And this is where he begins hiring, some of the characters that we see, important influencers that we see not only within the book, but still today in more contemporary game development, like Cliff Bludzinski and Mark Ryan. And, again, with this type of stuff, Epic is incredibly important to the history of, I would argue, of game development in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But games haven't been taken that seriously as an industry for that long, which means there's not a ton of like archival information about Epic Games the same way that there is for like the history of IBM or Apple or the Bell Labs, these other like larger media and computational companies that we can trace throughout the 20th century. So luckily for me, there was thriving online and print early games journalism, which was basically a bunch of gaming fans who would run these interviews with these at the time small companies. And a lot of my archival research came from essentially the Wayback Machine and the Internet Archive and finding these old message boards and these old gaming articles. So in a lot of ways, the history is kind of a communal history, told not only through interviews with Tim Sweeney, but through conversations that folks were having amongst themselves in the late 90s and early 2000s as they were playing these games and figuring out the Unreal Engine.
That's really cool. I didn't think about the struggles with documenting early games history in quite that way. So that's really great.
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of like the double assault of not enough people took it seriously, and also it's a company, so they're not exactly going to have all of their stuff out there for free. They're not or easily accessible. They're not getting a ton of patents, so there's not that type of archival material. So it really was community archiving, which is why it's important to support the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine. So.
Amen. On a more serious note, the introduction also makes an argument for platform studies and why platform studies, studying the platform games are made on and played on, is really critical for game studies and also kind of humanity. So I'm going to read a quote. You write, "We move into a future where game engines are increasingly the eye of a hurricane of capitalistic, militaristic, raced, and hegemonic practice. Platform studies must attend to the power to navigate through the storm." So this is obviously very poetic as a sentence. I love that. But it also opens this door for us to question how video game platforms are become this kind of, or rather they platform certain modalities of being. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about this, since you're my platform studies friend.
Sure, absolutely. So the platform studies as both a book series from MIT and also as a which I think your last guest Jose also Zagal also published in, right, for the Virtual Boy.
Yep.
But also as a kind of subfield of study, is interested in looking at like these material artifacts, whether that is hardware like the Virtual Boy or or the Atari 2600, or software like Flash. Anastasia Salter wrote a really great book on that, and then the Unreal Engine. And I think there's a couple things that are important about doing this type of work. One, especially in humanistically trained fields and textually trained fields, it can be easy to overlook, some of the underlying, scare word underlying, like technological systems that we build upon when we're developing these games. Not because I think they have an overly deterministic effect, and this is actually a criticism of platform studies that I try to address in the book, in that, when you're taking a deep dive into the tech, you can almost overcredit it for the decisions and practices that are made by human writers and human developers. But at the same time, the materiality of these objects, right, not just literally the physical ways in which they work, but the underlying ideological and other logics that are built into how these systems are designed, do play with designers and play with creators in important ways that we need to be able to analyze as scholars, right? And so always kind of thinking both at the level of culture and materiality, and how those things aren't separate but are actually entangled together, right? And so a big argument in I would say the theoretical contribution of the book, beyond just the specific histories and stories that it tells, is this argument that the Unreal Engine is as much an ideological and cultural object as it is a technological object, right? And we have to be reading these pieces of technology in both cultural and material ways.
So you're a Unity fan?
Well, it was actually funny when I was writing this book. It was during that 4-month period when Unity changed their monetization system, and everyone was like, "We're going to dump Unity. We're going to go to Unreal or go to Godot." And I mean, not only was that useful because it gave Unreal a little bit of a bump, and the more people use it, the more people I hope will eventually read this book. But for me, it actually helped the argument of this book too, of right, licensing agreements are an important part of the engine, right?
Yeah.
Like what makes the engine is not just the code base, it's also the user base, it's also the legal implications of it, it's also end user license agreements, right? All these things are part of this mess or this assemblage that create what the game engine is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, well, that's kind of the next question, so I'll save it for the next question. But I want to talk about America's Army, because it's, I mean, what a game.
What a game.
What a game.
What games.
Games. So your first proper chapter after the introduction talks about America's Army, which, if you didn't know, was a recruitment tool, also a video game, right? But predominantly the purpose of it was not entertainment, but to recruit for the U.S. Armed Forces. And it was live from 2002 until 2022, when the servers were finally shut down. But now they're fan-hosted servers and such online. So the entire game is absolutely fascinating to study, in my opinion. But there's one particular aspect of your chapter which, in my opinion, is intimately tied to techno-feminism, and that's how strict the code of conduct policy was for America's Army, which I had no clue about until I read your chapter. And this runs as a almost counter narrative to what we hear a lot of game companies, and in fact, hi Twitch. Don't kick my channel off the internet. But we hear this rhetoric a lot of, well, that's kind of just the culture. We can't help it when people are trolling, or we can't help it when people are antisocial or are, in some cases actually breaking the law. But that wasn't the case for America's Army. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so America's Army is such a fascinating piece of media, and so many scholars have written about it because it's such an important cultural touchstone, particularly in the United States. But as you mentioned, it's a U.S. military recruitment tool that was explicitly aimed at recruiting 16 to 22-year-old boys into the U.S. Army as a reaction to waning recruitment in the late 90s after the Gulf War. And I write about it in relation to the Unreal Engine because it was the first game made using the second version of the Unreal Engine, which was really Unreal's kind of major coming out into the game dev scene, but also a lot of the things that were built into the Unreal Engine in order to make America's Army became kind of prepackaged in vanilla or standard Unreal, right? And so America's Army and Unreal kind of make each other in this process.
Yeah.
But a part of the cultural work that America's Army was trying to do was actually threading this really interesting needle between games masculinity and this kind of like at the time especially they reference like the Rambo movies a lot, right? Like this kind of hyper masculine, almost homoerotic, like major muscly male violent figure, um, who they saw as like, on the one hand great getting children interested in combat, but at the same time they actually saw as not an ideal soldier, right? Like there's all these documentations where they're like, we don't want recruits into the US Army who think they can go and like Rambo around, right? Because the US Army requires discipline, it requires very specific types of teamwork. And so they're like, okay, how do we leverage the violence of video games, which was also happening at the cultural moment, when we were having things like the debates over Mortal Kombat. Jeff Sessions was running congressional hearings about whether or not video games should be banned or regulated. And they're saying, well, okay, if we accept that video games are violent, how do we actually take that violence and direct it in ways that are productive for the state, right? And so not only recruiting boys, but also training them in ways of I'm going to use heavy scare quotes here, honorable and proper violence. And one of the things that was really important in America's Army, the video game, was that it was squad-based combat. But unlike a lot of other games at the time, if you were griefing other players or trolling other players or doing friendly fire on your own fire team, you would get an initial warning, which would put your character into a simulation of a jail cell, like a military police jail cell. So you could move around, but not actually play the game. You'd just be in that cell. And if you continue that behavior, they would actually ban your IP address, right? And so there was this very explicit acknowledgement of like, we have to ban this negative behavior because this isn't the type of behavior that we want to see from military recruits. And so combining like that type of attention to moderation and banning, along with the culture of bringing in active duty military to also be playing the game with these teenagers, fostered this culture of like what the proper way to play was. I'm not saying that's like inherently a good thing, and certainly there's lots of things to critique there. But in what you're alluding to with how we imagine online moderation and game moderation, and Epic is now, a bunch of companies now trying to use like AI to like filter out swear words and things like that. This was a very distinct method of moderation, right? Of like not only being ready with essentially the military version of the banhammer, but like bringing in the cultural cachet of the military to say like, this is not an honorable way for men to play. I think is really interesting from a historical and like gendered dynamic.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about that? So in the U.S. Army's, or I guess military in general, in their eyes, what was the appropriate way to play?
Yeah, so they have a couple, the abstract principles, they call it their leadership principles. It's an acronym. I kind of forget what the original things stand for, but it's like service, integrity, these kind of abstract values that soldiers are supposed to embody. But from like a very strict gameplay perspective, it was things like you shouldn't be briefing, like running and gunning, right? Like that's not proper combat. You're supposed to hold your gun down, then stand in a single place, pick your target, fire, put your gun down, and move on, right? Because it's actually not safe to just run around and spray a machine gun, right? Which goes totally against almost every other like first-person shooter, like ludic logic that we see. or they also had this really interesting thing where, and I didn't talk about this a ton in the book, hence research left behind, but this thing where no matter what you, so it was player versus player, but you always saw yourself as a U.S. Army serviceman, and you always saw the enemy as a vaguely Iraqi Arabic soldier, right? So you would never play as the enemy, right? Because the enemy doesn't follow proper military rules. The enemy is not disciplined. The enemy is not honorable, right? And so both this kind of visual impact, but also very like strict mechanics of what you should and shouldn't be doing were enforced.
This is
And they gave it out for free. So
incredible. So to connect it back to, I just want to close the loop here. I think you, in the book, you do a great job of this. And then I think you've probably also done a really good job of this. I was so absorbed in listening to these details. Let's close the loop here. So how did America's Army impact the development of the Unreal Engine and Unreal as a company? Just one more time.
Yeah. So in addition to technical elements, so for example, one of the major technical hurdles that the Army was encountering was like vehicular combat and how to handle that. They licensed external physics engines like Karma that ended up being kind of the default physics engine for Unreal itself. So again, a literal kind of reverse influence where the game is building the engine as much as the engine is being used to build the game. But what I also found really interesting was, you know, getting licenses for the Unreal Engine back in the day was really expensive. It wasn't like the models we have now where the engine is free, but then you start paying royalties after you make like $1 million on your published game. But America's Army came packaged with the Unreal level editor. And that was actually the first way and the earliest way for both game players and game developers, if they didn't have $500,000 to lease the Unreal Engine, to access some of these development tools. And so you had a whole, subset of that generation of game developers first getting access to Unreal through America's Army and learning how to use Unreal and build levels and think about gameplay through the lens of developing games or developing mods and levels for America's Army, including these very strict types of ludic and mechanical interfaces, right? And so there's this kind of really interesting, I think, cultural history that's going on there. And then finally, one of the directors of America's Army, Michael Capps, leaves the MOVES Institute, which is a naval-funded research center that was part of the development of America's Army, and becomes the president of Epic Games, right? So in addition to there being technical and cultural overlap, there's literally interpersonal overlap between the U.S. Army and then the development of Epic Games as a company.
That's the part that shocked me the most. I mean, this is not a secret, right? This is all like very public information, but
no, totally public. And intentionally so. Like the military was like, yes, we're giving out propaganda. Everything's propaganda. Why wouldn't we give out propaganda? Like straight up.
I kept having flashbacks to the episode of The Simpsons where the youths become a boy band for the Navy.
Uh-huh.
It's just join the Navy, but play backwards.
Yvonne Niad, yep.
Oh, I love that.
It's a very geriatric millennial reference, but yeah.
Well, that's the tagline of this.
That's who we are. Yep.
Of this program is geriatric millennials. Okay, so you talked about Unreal Engine. I mean, and you talk about it in multiple ways, but one of the ways you discuss it in the book is as a development tool, and you have this beautiful introduction where you talk about how students who are encountering Unreal Engine for the first time are often perplexed by the Z-axis. And I, too, have been personally victimized by trying to import an asset in Unreal and being like, why is it on its side? So
on its side, yep.
So talk to us a little bit. Tell us what the Z-axis is, what it does, and then how it tells us about the priorities of a game engine. Yeah.
So for folks who haven't worked in 3D space a lot, if you imagine your fingers like this, depending on a three-dimensional block or grid of paper, depending on the different software that you use, the orientations of the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis might be different, right? X is almost always horizontal to the screen, but sometimes y is vertical on the screen, sometimes y is kind of towards the user, sometimes y is up, and y and z kind of get flipped. And while it creates these kind of interesting quirks where sometimes if the import systems aren't programmed well, you'll move an asset from like a 3D modeling program that uses Y up into a Z up engine like Unreal, and it'll come in sideways because it hasn't translated right. And I encountered these issues teaching actually engineering students who were interested in better visualizing some of their designs, and I was teaching them Unreal, and a lot of their stuff was coming in sideways because of the original program they were using to develop their models.
Maya.
And it got me thinking, like, there hasn't been, from what I've seen, like a history and explanation of why this z-axis up or down or y-axis like why it matters. And there's some like apocryphal tales out in game development world about like which one's better, which one's like the real up, like is x up, or x is never up, right? Actually, unless you're at NASA, but that's a different thing. Is y up or z up? And like funny little culture wars there. But as I was kind of digging through these different 3D modeling and CAD programs, and the history of the development of them, I found a couple of overlapping kind of historical and sociological phenomena that I wanted to write about. So the first was an imagination of, or the axis inherits an imagination of how the developer thinks the user is interacting with the screen. And so this isn't a hard and fast rule, but something that I saw both kind of online and then actually going through these software packages was that programs that were primarily thought to be used for like digital animation, so stuff like Maya, right, for 3D animation, where they imagine the user's body looking at the screen and staring at the screen as though it were a television set that's kind of in front of your eyes, tend to have Y be the up axis, right? Because if we imagine a piece of graph paper, Y goes up and X goes to the side, and you're projecting to a flat television screen in front of you. Whereas programs in engineering and architecture, where they're imagining their users looking down onto blueprints, Z ended up being the up axis, right? Because you're kind of looking down at Y, and X and Y form the ground plane, and Z is kind of actually the machine or camera plane for building these systems. So this is really interesting because Unreal is one of the few game development systems that uses a Z up axis. And so I kind of got into this rabbit hole of like, where is this coming from? Why? Partially, I think it's because Tim Sweeney was trained as an engineer, so he was probably in Z up world when he was originally programming this system. But as also part of that, there was this longer history of like why we interact with interfaces and gaming interfaces the way we do, and whose bodies have influenced how we imagine looking at the screen. And there's this longer history that I won't spend a ton of time talking about here that's in the book, of individual FPS players back in the 90s and the specific configurations that they would build between their mouse and the keyboard and the screen before there was like standard WASD movement to try to get an edge on their opponents. And certain like bodily configurations of really popular players became mainstreamed into interfaces. So, going back to our earlier conversation, we talk about game engines, are not just technical choices. They're also cultural choices, like literally the bodies of, or maybe figuratively, but figuratively, the bodies and motions of 90s FPS shooters are now built into the 3D software that we use. So yeah, I just thought that was probably my most like deep dive geeky chapter, but it's actually kind of one of my favorites because it's just it's such like a random thing of like, why is this axis the way it is? But yeah.
Yeah, I cut out a question that I wanted to ask because this chapter is really good at uncovering the history of first-person shooters and the history of, like, I honestly had no idea that WASD was not the kind of standard default. And you talk about that,
For a
right?
long time.
Yeah, for a
Yep.
long time there, you could choose your own configuration, right? And then
Yep.
you,
And people would pass around configurations, like, oh, this popular player uses, like, there was like trading and bartering. It's fascinating. Yeah.
and you also mentioned, like, there's one sentence that I was like, oh, I didn't even think about this, that the reason I think WASD is the standard is because of World of Warcraft, right? When WoW came out, they treated it like the standard, and that, yeah.
Yep. So again, it's like the fun scholarly question that all of us nerds like to do, right? Like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? It's like, what came first, the game or the player, right? And we kind of see this like interesting like cultural embodied loop in how we're expected to interact with 3D space.
Yeah. From a user experience kind of perspective, that's something that I hadn't considered either, is how integrated, particularly these highly skilled players were in determining how we use.
And it's actually a major, the Z-axis thing is kind of funny, but if anyone on the stream has used Unreal, you navigate Unreal as though you were playing a first-person shooter, right? Like, you navigate through space using WASD and using the mouse to pivot and look around. And that's very weird for most like professional development, like 3D modeling software. And so like there's actually a learning curve to learning Unreal if you're not a gamer and if you're not a first-person shooter gamer, to like, how do I even navigate the space? Why would I ever use WASD as like a navigation tool? And it's like, well, because you haven't embodied what it means to be a game player.
It's in your gamer muscles.
Yep.
All right, I want to know about BioShock, just the whole plot of the game. No, I'm kidding. You talk about BioShock Infinite, and it's a game that's talked about for so many reasons because it's such a cool, impressive, thoughtful game. But you talk about Elizabeth and this kind of idea of agency, and also the technology which made the character of Elizabeth in BioShock Infinite possible. And that tech is called Kismet. So can you tell me a little bit more about Elizabeth's agency, how Elizabeth is talked about, and how Kismet, that technology, helped?
Yeah, so Elizabeth, one could argue the main character in BioShock Infinite, even though she's not the player character, was, from nowadays kind of companion standards, was probably not amazingly technical, but at the time when the game came out, was praised as being like such a living companion, player to this game who you don't have to protect and guard, and which again has all these fascinating gender components into it, but generated a lot of conversation around the role of companion AI in games and their interactions with the player. But also like interesting theorization on when you have this deeply embedded character who is playing the game with you, how do we theorize them as a co-player, right? Like, are they a part of the game? Are they another player next to you? Are they a co-author in the game's experience? Because they're not just following, simple scripted instructions. They're in some ways dynamically reacting to what the player's doing in more interesting ways, I think, than like just a physics engine. Although physics does cool stuff too. And so in kind of trying to put my money where my mouth is for the book, I was like, okay, like Elizabeth is a great example of a character that game studies scholars have spent a ton of time researching, right? Again, like America's Army, there's so much really awesome research out there asking these questions about Elizabeth, but there wasn't a ton about her production or the code that also makes her up, right? And again, also interesting that I'm talking about her as a gendered object. And so Elizabeth was constructed through an early version of what would eventually become Blueprints, but kind of Unreal's visual coding and visual scripting language, which at the time was called Kismet, which was designed to not only streamline game production, but also to allow non-programmers, which also tends to have a gendered component to it of like who counts as a real programmer and who doesn't, to have access to the game's code, right? So it like wasn't scary for writers or artists to be contributing to the behavioral logic that made up this Elizabeth character. And so I try to write about this in the chapter, in terms of how Elizabeth's body and her agency work not only from a mechanical perspective, but from a narrative perspective through the way that she is constructed in the Unreal Engine, right? So Elizabeth, I won't go super deep into it, but for those of you who haven't played the game, she basically has magical powers. She can open up tears in quantum reality and leap around to different worlds and different universes, which makes sense and works in the game because of the way that she interacts with the system of Unreal in a fundamentally different way than the player can, right? Because the player is bound by kind of linear progress and linear narrative flow, where Elizabeth, both mechanically and narratively, isn't. And so the goal of that chapter is to kind of trace, like, how do we as game scholars bring in, this literary theory and these understandings of what is a player, who has agency, how do characters exist in texts and in game worlds. And rather than, rehash like the old game studies debate of what's more important, the story or the mechanics, right? Like, we're kind of past that. And more about, like, how do we actually read her as a literary character that is based both upon her narrative elements, but also upon her her design and her unique interactions with the game world and with the engine world.
I had no idea Elizabeth was that interesting. So thank you.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So I have to follow up that very wonderful answer with a really banal question, because I personally am always curious when game scholars talk about a game. I found there are two very polar opposite takes. You have the people who are like, oh, I'm a huge fan of this game, so I study it because I'm a huge fan. Or you have the opposite of people being like, actually, I hate this game. So I was wondering if you had any kind of personal, very subjective feelings toward BioShock Infinite.
Yeah, I'm mediocre to hate that game. So I studied it because I thought the Elizabeth character was interesting. But honestly, talking about embodiment, I get really bad motion sickness in first-person shooter games. And so in order to play that game for research, I was downing like 3 Dramamine a day for like a solid 2 weeks. And just basically self-medicating to be able to make it through playing that game. So one, motion sickness is real. And I probably have permanent scarring on the inside of my body from doing that chapter of research. But we do it for the love of the scholarship.
That is awful. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I won't be playing many VR games anytime soon.
Yeah, that's totally fair. On to a less bad topic. Actually, I said that, but I think this is actually worse. Your book has it all. I mean, every single chapter is just full of so many amazing ideas and concepts. And chapter 4 opens with the moon landing conspiracy, and I lost it. I absolutely lost it.
Yeah, I think your listeners are probably like, what the hell is this book?
But it's so good. You're reading it and you're just like, oh, this all makes sense. And then, you stop and you kind of pull back and you're like, does it? No, it does. I have to say that so people think I'm not a total shill, right? But the moon landing conspiracy myth is so phenomenal. So I think we have to start there, right? I think that for people who are listening or watching who have not heard of the conspiracy theory that Apollo 11? Yeah. The 1969 Apollo 11 mission did not actually land on the moon, but was faked with Hollywood. Walk us through that, the key points of the conspiracy theory, and then we're going to talk about how it relates to Unreal.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot to walk through. Basically, it's vaguely anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Hollywood and Stanley Kubrick filming the entire Apollo mission in a studio because the tech couldn't actually work, and the U.S. just needed a win against the Soviets in the space race, right? And they kind of enlisted this massive conspiracy that also didn't leak somehow. And there's like really fun / awful, I don't know, like investigations into this of like, well, why is the flag moving the way it does when they raise it, or like, well, the shadows on the astronauts, like those are coming from a floodlight or from a spotlight and not like the actual sunlight, just like, which is all not true. But like, yeah, really, yeah, there's some stuff out there, but just in case, like, the moon landing did happen. It's there. You can it's there. I promise.
So then, this is, I don't know how this could possibly get more strange, but here we are. So 50 years later, in 2019, NVIDIA releases an interactive visualization tool, which was with the expressed purpose of disproving conspiracy theories, right? So they're like, hey,
Yes.
look, here's a bunch of research, here's a bunch of lectures, here's a bunch of documentation, and here is a visualization tool where you can recreate the conditions of the moon landing to prove that it was real.
Yep.
So did it work? Did it change the hearts and minds of conspiracy theorists?
I mean, of course not, right? Because the and actually kind of the fun part of this chapter is like, the truth is a cultural construct, right? Like the conspiracy theorists aren't interested in truth. They're interested in narrative and in some cases racism. But yeah, so NVIDIA releases this moon landing demo built in Unreal that was, they say was used to prove the moon landing. Really, it was used to sell NVIDIA graphics cards. But it was part of this push to the kind of moment of graphical rendering that we have now, called physically based rendering, which is this idea that now that graphics cards are fast enough and we've made more efficient algorithms, lighting and rendering, the major work that game engines do in 3D space, is now scientifically accurate, right? It's drawing on the real physics of the world rather than fake physics that we were using in the 90s and 2000s. And it's so good now that we can plug these numbers into the Unreal Engine, and through the power of Unreal and an NVIDIA graphics card, we can totally photorealistically recreate the moon landing, thereby disproving all of the conspiracy accounts, right? So again, it's this really interesting story of like they're kind of playing with this cultural phenomena of the conspiracy theories, but in a way that's not only, again, selling a product, but also making like a truth claim, right? That like the rendering systems in Unreal now represent reality. Like they are good enough to simulate truth, physical truth, to the point where we can now start disclaiming conspiracy theories, right? So again, it's a really interesting mix of like cultural and technical work that's going on in those demos.
I almost don't want to ask this question. You know the question that's coming. What research on conspiracy theories did you leave behind?
So there was a whole a whole arm of Fox News conspiracy theories that were just really interesting. If I were writing a sequel to this book, which, I mean, I don't know, I might be actually, but your next guest is going to be you already advertised Adrianna, right? Who talks about the connection between right-wing culture and gaming culture. It's this funny thing of like gaming being used both to like against like this kind of reactionary like QAnon culture, because all this stuff is built into this, right? Like QAnon, Elders of Zion, sorry, this is a deep dive. Conspiracy theories, again, it's all largely based upon anti-Semitic tropes, but how we're seeing a gaming culture now that is both reflecting kind of these rooted, very European, very American conspiracy theories, with also like these interesting truth claims. And yeah, it's creating real interesting, messy cultural objects, messy news stations, messy actions and assaults on Capitol buildings and government buildings. So yeah.
So just to make sure that I understood, I'm going to circle back. You watched a lot of Fox News?
So Fox used to have this show, I forget the title, but it was basically like a debunking conspiracy theories show, where they didn't really do much debunking. It was kind of like the guy on the History Channel was always like, but it could have been aliens, right? Like it was the conspiracy theory version of that, where, no, of course this isn't real, but like maybe it is, right? And so yeah, I just got to see like Geraldo Rivera be like, yeah, I don't know, maybe the moon landing was faked. Who knows? Just yeah, it's so got to subject myself to that, which was fun. I don't need to subject the readers to that.
Yeah, no.
That's a footnote.
No, I was also wondering if he did any deep dives into any kind of our conspiracy on Reddit or any of the Chans, the 4chan, the 8chan. I guess that's between you and God, I guess.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny. For current research, which I won't talk about because we're doing the book right now, I actually am doing a little bit of that dive. But for Unreal, no, I don't want to sully Epic Games' name by aligning them too closely with that stuff.
Fair enough. We'll have to have you back on for your next book. I'm excited for all the brain worms and all the brain melting. So we are now on our penultimate question, and we're going to talk about the penultimate chapter of the book. So chat, get those questions for Q&A ready if you have questions about the Unreal Engine. If you want to know how to program your game in Unreal Engine, now's the chance to ask Jim. I'm teasing. Like really specific and nuanced questions though. That's
the multi-threaded processing. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Jim will just totally live troubleshoot. No. Okay, so in the penultimate chapter of your book, you coined a term called white photorealism in regards to this physically based rendering system that we just talked about. So can you tell us what it means and why it's important?
Yeah, so the Moon Conspiracy chapter and this white photorealism chapter are linked together. And it's kind of where I bring the book home in terms of like, okay, we've done a history of Unreal. We've gone through Unreal versions 1, 2, and 3, and now we're talking about 4, which at the time was like the contemporary version of the engine, and now we're on Unreal Engine 5. And as a lot of kind of gamers know in gaming culture, like engines, they do a lot of work, but they get the most kind of street cred for looking good, right? Like engines are supposed to have certain looks and certain vibes and certain visual aesthetics, and they're good at some stuff and bad at other stuff. And so Unreal, particularly Unreal 4 and 5, has always had a reputation for photorealism, right? And this kind of like hyper real, technically advanced rendering. But the implication of photoreal, right, is not the same thing as physically real, right? Because you're not necessarily reproducing the world and the way light works in the world. You're reproducing the way light works in a camera, right, and in film. Hence the photo of photoreal. And many film and media history scholars dating back to the 60s, right, have written that the camera is not designed to capture all people equally well by default, right? How film chemical compositions were built, what type of coating was on lenses, how color grading worked, who was considered important to feature in films, who wasn't, deeply impacted, right, the way that film and television looked, with the classic example being that especially in the United States and Europe, film was graded and developed in order to capture white skin, right? That was the primary actor, that was the primary developers, those were the primary directors, those were the characters we were seeing on film and television. And so the farther away your skin tone was from white, which was not only seen as the most important, but also neutral and natural, right? Everything else was a deviation from that. The darker your skin was, the harder it was to show up on film. We still have this problem, because the camera lenses don't work to the same depth that the human eye does, and so you're always making sacrifices. Game engines do the same thing, right? And so part of this work in these chapters was exploring, like, okay, when we're talking about photorealism, when we're talking about reality and this type of rendering, what is getting worked on and what's not, and how are different representations of humanity being rendered or taken with care. And I want to pause for one quick second and say this argument is not that like the Unreal Engine is racist, right? Like this isn't that piece. The argument is actually following from lots of scholarship in science and technology studies that studies, the ways in which science happens and the ways in which technology is developed is not a neutral process. It's a human process. The decisions that people make are based upon the people that are around them, right? And are based upon unconscious desires that they think may or may not be important. And so in the moon landing chapter, right, I kind of set up this idea that Unreal is now standing in for truth, right? Because Unreal, when it's effective at rendering, can now disprove conspiracy theories, supposedly. And so this final chapter goes into the MetaHumans project. And if you watch the original, which is Unreal's kind of, or Epic's kind of like photorealistic human mannequin reproduction built-in plugin, right? Where the idea is you can create an infinite variety of infinite types of people. And if you look at the original advertisements for this, characters with white skin look better than characters with non-white skin, right? And again, this isn't saying like there's like racist developers, but like non-white characters that are shown don't have as good midtones or highlights. They're not lit as well. They're not, the rendering just isn't good. Or isn't as good. And at the time I was working alongside or collaborating with a computer science faculty member at Yale, Ted Kim, who studies hair and the history of hair rendering and skin rendering. And he was also saying that there's a longer history in computer graphics of white skin being treated as the default. Yep. And so the white photorealism chapter and white photorealism as concept essentially argues that when we talk about what's real in game engines, when we talk about what looks right, there's an implicit understanding that it's what looks right to the white eye, right? Like to white developers, to white skin, to white figures. And it doesn't have to be that way, right? There's not like an inherent thing that the Unreal Engine will always only ever produce white skin, but that's where the research has been. That's where the focus has been. And so it's actually a cultural problem, not a technical problem, right? And so when we're thinking about, what photorealism means, that it's not just a scientific question, it's also a cultural and even racial question that gets bundled in with this apparatus.
Very well spoken and very well described and detailed. I'm really glad that your book on platforms discusses race. I think it's something that's absolutely critical. These are critical conversations that we should be having. So the final question before we get to the Q&A from the audience is, tell me about the research that got left behind in acting platforms.
Yeah, I'll just drop a couple because I want to make sure we can get to Q&A. We were talking a little bit before the show. I do a lot of my writing as I'm researching, so there's not like a whole chapter that was left out, but more kind of threads that I saw that just because of time, weren't able to follow up on. In the America's Army chapter, a lot of that material was found in the Strong archive in the Strong Museum of Play at Rochester, in Rochester, New York. If anyone's around Rochester, please visit the Strong Museum of Play. Also, please contact your congressman to say that they should uncut the funding to the Strong Museum of Play, which just got their funding cut by Doge. Speaking of right-wing conspiracy theories. Anyway, in those archives and materials, America's Army, right, primarily designed to recruit men, primarily figures male avatars. And there was this whole like weird military like sub-study about why not women? Why not have women in these games? And interesting enough, there was nothing in there about, some of the weird arguments that we're hearing now, like, do women belong in combat? What would it mean to get players to shoot women? I think that it was that women are too complicated to model and therefore too expensive, right? And therefore not efficient use of government funds, right? And so again, like just real interesting gender dynamics in similar to the white photorealism concept, like what counts as the default body and what counts as what should of course be modeled, and then what is extra, what is not needed, what is unnecessary. So that was kind of a fun archival find that I didn't really have time to dig into in the book. Yeah, and then there was a part of I might still come back to this at some point, as we all promise ourselves that we do. There was part of the Elizabeth chapter 2 where I really wanted to do a literary tie-in between Elizabeth and Octavia Butler books, which unfortunately I didn't. It just again didn't have time, didn't have space to. That chapter's already long enough. Um, but in terms of this question of agency, right? So Kismet, you're literally connecting these threads of code to these visual boxes of code, and this is what makes Elizabeth work. And part of the work that I try to do in that chapter is talking about agency, not just as this idea of like, I have agency in the world when I am able to enact my will on the world, whether that's the real world or the game world. And that's what player agency means. But agency is a more collaborative and enmeshed thing, right? That we actually have more agency when we're more connected rather than when we're disconnected. And there's some really great work in studies of Octavia Butler's science fiction. Octavia Butler, again, famous Black science fiction author, that talks about, the particular ways in which white cultures and particularly Black cultures, but also non-white cultures, non-European cultures, imagine what agency is and what freedom is, and that freedom isn't necessarily a radical individuality, but can instead actually be like, freedom can mean connections that you can't remove yourself from. And so there was like, I don't know, a poetic theoretical strand that I wish I'd been able to get down through, but maybe later. But that,
It's your next book.
Also just read Octavia Butler, please. It's awesome, everyone, if you haven't read her work.
Okay. I mean, I am absolutely obsessed with the idea that women were too difficult to model. That's wonderful.
Yep.
Great. Leave us out of it. Okay, so there is a couple questions from chat that I saw. Chris, if you could help me throw them my way. I saw, do you think, oh yes, this was a question that we've discussed on other streams. Do you think that the existence of game engines, Unreal and Unity being two examples, but obviously not the only examples, is a net positive or a net negative for game developers as a whole, in the sense, or are we losing out on creativity if we're using a set engine that, as we've discussed tonight, has a set way of rendering light, has a set way of rendering skin, so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's a really awesome question. And it's one, when I teach like intro to game design or intro to game development classes, we talk about a lot, right? And so because I'm an academic, I try to avoid positive and negative. Right. But it's what are we getting and what are we giving, right? And so part of it is positional, right? So for me, working in the Unreal Engine or teaching my students as an individual developer, in a lot of ways, I am bound by the decisions that were made for me in moving into that system. And that's, not necessarily a bad thing. Like we always have constraints in design work and in engineering work. So that's okay. And certainly I'm able to develop things much more quickly because I have access to tools, especially now for free, like Unity and Unreal, than I would if I had to like jump into C++ and start hacking some stuff together. So in that case, I think there's real positives there. But for larger companies who are now, instead of building their own in-house engines, are licensing Unity and Unreal, for those folks, their license agreements include direct contact with the Epic developers, right? So if Square Enix contracts Epic and Unreal to make Final Fantasy VII Remake, which they did, they're not bound by anything. They can contract with Epic and say, hey, this code, this rendering doesn't work the way we want it to. Can you modify it or teach our developers how to get in there and tweak things? And while Unreal isn't open source, it has an open code base. Like you can just download the C++ code base of Unreal. And if you have the cultural and technical capacities and monetary capacities to modify it, you're not bound by that. So, I say that part of the answer to say like, whenever we're asking these questions of positive or negative, it's positive and negative for whom, right? Because different folks are impacted differently. But, just to very, very quickly add on, because this is actually the research I'm doing now, with a graduate student, Logan Davis at RPI. I'm really excited to be working with him on this, on Jonathan Blow and his kind of like homemade game programming language, Jai, and some other like homebrew game engines, where the argument for these custom programming languages is actually exactly this, right? That we're giving over as developers too much of our agency and too much of our creativity to these big companies, these platform owners, and so like there's that kind of like interesting like anti-capitalist critique, but then it's also wound up like this interesting gendered thing of, oh, and by the way, like you're not even a good game developer if you need to use an engine to like build your stuff, right? So like there's this like interesting like mix of like anti-corporate fight but also like toxicity built in there. So there's all kinds of like really different types of game engine cultures that are influencing and having these debates around like what is a game engine, what should it be for, and how does it influence and relate to the craft of development. And I won't get into this, but like haven't even touched AI, right, in any of this, which brings in a whole other set of labor issues and production issues.
That's the next stream that we're gonna talk about at some point. So the last question kind of ties into this. Someone in chat asked if you looked at CD Projekt Red's engine tech for Skin, but I will go a step further and say, what about like any other engine, proprietary or open source? Is anyone doing a good job at getting darker melanation right, shall we say?
Yeah. Yes, and I want to make sure that I'm referencing my own book to make sure I get the name right. But the proprietary engine that was used to develop Horizon Zero West, right, the Horizon series. So internal to that studio, there was actually a small but important like Twitter discussion about how well they rendered all types of skin, including black skin. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One, that game, especially the sequel, the Forbidden West game, right, has been targeted at like rendering women too well, including white women, right? That like Aloy now somehow looks bad because she looks real, right, and not like a yassified like model. But also importantly, it connects with this larger argument that like it's not necessarily that the technology itself is what is making these like badly rendered or poorly rendered characters, right? It's in a lot of cases because Horizon is not using Unreal, but they're using physically based rendering. They're using PBR algorithms to build their stuff. So it's actually not about like the underlying math and that like PBR is bad or Unreal is bad.
Right.
It's the care and craft that the developers had and the foresight to think of that like, okay, when we're rendering these things, like how do we make sure that we're actually rendering different types of people in ways that look correct and that are respectful, right? And so I think that's again really useful because it's not about calling. I'm not saying the question did this, but just to really re-interface, it's not about calling it the Unreal Engine racist or game developers racist. It's about like this is a craft, it's a practice, which means we control it, we can improve it, we can be more nuanced and more intentional with the type of thing that we're doing, and it not only is just better from like a moral and ethical practice, but like it makes games look better, right, for a wider variety of people. So kudos to the Horizon team for the work they did there.
Yeah, I think having positive examples of groups that are doing it well is super helpful. And actually, from I know about this much, tiny, I'm doing a gesture with my hands to indicate a tiny amount about art history. But what I do know about art history is that the way people have chosen to depict lighting has changed over time, right? With better technology to think about lighting. And I think we're seeing this in our own kind of micro art history of games with how lighting and skin tone is impacted. So, well, thank you all so much. Pardon?
Yep, you're good. Yeah.
Jim's like, I want to go. So we've gone over time, and I do apologize for that, but we're academics, so it is tradition. But it's sadly time to say goodbye. So please, chatters, and if you're watching this after the fact, join me in thanking Dr. Malazita for his time and patience and excellent book. Jim, do you have anything you would like to plug? Any new publications or anything else?
One, thanks so much for having me on, and thanks everyone for listening and for the great questions. Feel free to bug me at jmalazita at Blue Sky. I'm on that social. I'm also on Twitter, but I mostly use it to stalk Tim Sweeney, not to tweet anymore. If folks out there, are interested in doing this type of thinking, right, like this hybridized, like thinking seriously about art history and media history, but also embedded in game production, take a look at RPI, not only for our like game design major, but we have graduate programs in critical game design, including master's and PhD programs, where we attract weirdos like me who are doing like not quite full media studies, not quite game development, but like that weird, and I say weirdos in the most affectionate way, but like, the weird in between stuff. So, if you're interested in this type of research, there's lots of places that I think are doing it. Game studies as a field is really starting to mature in really exciting ways, and check out RPI's programs if you're interested in going that route.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. This has been illuminating. Also, thank you to Shawn, Pierre, and Adrianna Poindexter for the creation and use of our theme song that we use on this channel. Also to Nifty Chris, the Twitch mod, for classroom management, and to you, the viewers and listeners. Without you, none of this production would be possible. Listeners, viewers, and chatters, if you like this stream, VOD, or podcast, please make sure you're following with notifications on so that you know when we'll be live again. And you also know when the recording goes up. So if you're listening after the fact, you can head over to twitch.tv/professor_Ashley and follow to catch the next live stream, which is really fun because you get to ask questions. You can also find me on most social media platforms as Professor_Ashley. The Research Left Behind will be live again on June 5th with special guest Dr. Adrianna Massanari talking about her book, Gaming Democracy. Read it beforehand, come with questions. Good night, everyone, and we'll see you on June 5th.